let's begin. So I wanted to introduce, let me share really quickly the slide again. We have both Ben Vinegar as well as Jeremy Port. Let's see. There we go. And then we also have Mike from Smugmug, Mike Diaz, joining us today. So we're really excited. And with that, let me go ahead and start just asking a couple of quick questions. So Mike, thanks so much for being our guest today. Could you tell us a little bit about what Smugmug does, and how you ended up at Smugmug?
Okay, yes, great being here. Thanks for having me. So I've been at Smugmug for about 10 years now, and for anyone that's not aware, Smugmug is the safe, beautiful home for your photos. So we're trying to provide a place on the internet for serious photographers to host their websites and run their businesses, sell their photos, do things like that. So we pride ourselves on making sure that their high resolution photos are displayed as beautifully as possible, and they're stored securely, and people can be confident that that will always be the case. I think you're muted.
Great. Thanks so much for that. And then Ben, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name's Ben, and I'm a VP of engineering at Century. I've been at Century for 6 years, and I've before going to management here, I was one of the contributors to the UI and to the Century JavaScript SDK. And before that, I wrote a book called Third Party JavaScript, which was published back in 2013 and is super dated now. Today, I work with Jeremy and our project engineering team to basically build the product. And that's it.
Very cool. All right. Jeremy, please introduce yourself, and then also your origin story here.
Sure. Hey, everyone. So I'm Jeremy. I'm the lead product manager for performance. I joined Century about a year ago. When I had the opportunity, they were looking for somebody to come in on the product side with the performance application, and I was very excited by that opportunity. It's an interesting space for me. I love working on developer tooling and that sort of stack. So that's always been a passion of mine. And the opportunity to kind of come into the APM space with a different angle and a different value prop that was a little bit differentiated from some of the other tools out there. It was catnip to a product manager. So what could I say?
Very cool. Awesome. So wanted to ask you, Mike, part of the theme that we have in August is distributed tracing. And it's one of the features or actually how we do performance monitoring. You've actually been using Century for a while there before using our performance feature. Can you tell us a little bit about why Smugmug chose Century, and then a little bit about your experience using performance?
Yeah, so prior to using Century, we had our own kind of like homegrown exception handling logging methods, and we were sending the data to Splunk. It turns out that that's not really the right usage for Splunk, so it wasn't really helpful in trying to kind of monitor the actual errors that we were seeing. It was tough to debug them using just the Splunk logs we had, and overall it just wasn't really providing much benefit other than we would get weekly emails just telling us how many exceptions our JavaScript code was firing per week, and there was not really anything actionable. So it was probably, I would say 3, maybe 4 years ago that the VP of engineering tasked me with trying to find a better way to observe our JavaScript code and understand what sorts of things our users were seeing and what sorts of errors they're running into. And so there was a teammate of mine who was familiar with Century for doing that. And that was the first tool that we tried out. And it turned out that it solved our needs, and we liked using it, and we never actually compared against another tool.
We should be clear here that we did not invite Mike because we knew he would slam on other products. We did not know that.
Yeah, so and ever since then, it's just been much better. We have much better insight into the exceptions that our code has, and what our users are running into, and even across various eras of legacy code. We have, for those of you who are not aware, Smugmug has been around since 2002, 2003. So we still have pages on the site that are basically a giant PHP file with JavaScript, HTML, CSS alongside it, and that's served to the browser. That's not where we're going, obviously, but we still are able to kind of track exceptions on those sorts of pages too. And so as far as performance goes, we similar to how we didn't really have much visibility into our errors and exceptions in JavaScript, we didn't have any visibility into the performance our customers were seeing. We have all sorts of monitoring around our systems in AWS and things like that. But as far as real user metrics, we had nothing. And we weren't actively looking for a tool for that, but it turned out that I think it was last summer sometime, Century kind of sent out an email or posted a thing that there was a beta test for a performance monitoring solution that they were going to have. So I contacted Century and got Smugmug into the beta at that time. We started using it.
Hey, Mike, you mentioned that you didn't have anything instrumented, and I saw like in the poll, like it still seems like most people are just rely on customers. Like, would you say that was the model at the time? Like, customer says this page is slow, and then we would look into it?
Yeah, the way that we have our organization set up at Smugmug is we have our product teams, and we have a support specialist embedded with a product team, and they're kind of representing the voice of the customer in decisions that we're making or things that we're working on, and trying to provide that perspective. And so real bad issues would bubble up through that sort of channel. And that was kind of the primary way that we would hear about serious performance issues. Which isn't great, right? So
yeah, but what's impressive about the Smugmug website, as well as the pages, is that it looks very modern. I've seen other companies with like 10-year-old code bases, and it definitely shows. I won't mention any names, but so what's been the process like for you and your like all the different development teams just to migrate from code that was written more than 10 years ago to what you're doing now?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a slog. So there's definitely pages that you can hit on our site that don't look modern at all. And there's definitely other ones that look a lot better. We started using React when React kind of first came into the scene. So was that 5 or 6 years ago, maybe? And before that, most of our site was built on YUI, a JavaScript framework from Yahoo. And so around the time we switched to React is when we started to implement some of that logging I mentioned earlier with Splunk, and trying to do a little bit better job of at least tracking some of these errors that we were seeing. So we're still, as far as our front-end code goes, we're still entirely a React application now for the modern stuff we write. And it's been, it's a process to try to take pages and things that are 10, 15 years old that by and large are functional and meet the needs of our users, and try to make a case that we need to spend time with limited resources to rebuild those in a greenfield way. So it has to be a business case, I think. And also as we modernize our code base and work on things and provide integrations with tools like Century, it gives you better visibility to product managers to see the performance of features that we're releasing, and monitor how things are doing. And so that's a good case to make for why it's worthwhile to rewrite some of these things in a modern code base.
I think another thing like Kathy, you mentioned, like, hey, I browse to Smugmug and everything seems zippy and fast and modern and cool. And I think that for any developer who has like a modern machine and they're probably on a fantastic internet connection, you know, that's often the experience that we have when we're developing it. Or for example, you're developing it with a local database, so everything is fantastic and you go online, it's great. But then what you don't know is, oh, well, it turns out 20% of my users are in the UK, and actually the experience over there is very different than what I'm used to. And until you see that data, or you have your product specialist who's embedded with your team actually illustrate that fact to you, you don't really know.
That's a great point. And I mean, certainly, like, you know, all the developers have, you know, top of line hardware, and we generally have good internet connections. And the other aspect of our service is that serious photographers tend to have, you know, the sort of disposable income that leads to generally having a, you know, solid internet connection and having good hardware that they're processing photos on and all those sorts of things. So we do tend to have a blind spot to, you know, the user in another country that doesn't have that sort of luxury and maybe accessing it on a, you know, slow mobile connection or something like that.
Were there any like surprises that you found in like your customers user like real monitoring results that like was someone using a browser that's been, you know, deprecated, like anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting. I mean, I was kind of aware of, you know, the wide breadth of legacy browsers or old unsupported browsers that people are using, but it's interesting to start seeing that as we start collecting these performance traces, and we can see it grouped by browser or things like that. It is interesting to see how far back our users are going as far as, like, you know, using an ancient version of Firefox or Chrome or whatever the browser is. It is pretty widespread. That being said, I think that it is a lot better than obviously when I first started at Smugmug, because we don't have to worry about things like Internet Explorer 6 and problems like that.
Is there a pattern? Yeah, like, is it, other than an old browser, is there a pattern? I'm curious, maybe like a development practice. Like, is there something that always just seems to emerge, like a performance gotcha? You know, it could be like a React design pattern, or you know, I'm just curious if there's something that is at the source of things besides like, hey, here's a user in the middle of another continent.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing we're seeing now, so part of my current role at Smugmug is trying to re-architect our front-end code base and modernize it and provide a better internal framework for which our product teams can leverage to build pages and things like that. So what we're doing is we're now doing server-side rendering of our application. So a consideration that we didn't have to think about before is the performance of some of the API requests that might be made as part of the initial server-side render, because then you end up with a much slower time to first byte. So it's a balance between that, the metric of a time to first byte, versus how immediate the page is responsive, and is the content all there right when it paints, or are you loading in a lot of data on the client? It's kind of balancing the different metrics you're watching to try to get the best user experience.
Are you finding that the tool, you know, because I'm generally curious, are you finding that the tool is illustrating to you time to first byte? Like, are you finding that it's showing you data that helps you, you know, optimize towards that outcome?
Yeah, so I know that in the traces, it shows time to first byte as one of the like high level metrics. It kind of bubbles up. But what we're trying to focus most on is the core web vitals, especially since Google, you know, in recent years has placed more importance on those specific metrics as far as your search ranking and other, you know, performance things as far as how you show up in Google search. And less importance, we're placing less importance on time to first byte. I think it's useful to have there, but especially some of the other metrics, like the, you know, cumulative layout shift is one that we sometimes do pretty poorly on it with some of our legacy stuff, because we have a lot of data and content that gets fetched on the client and loaded in asynchronously after the page is loaded, and you get content jumping all over the place. So keeping an eye on that has been pretty useful as well.
Hey, Kathy, can we do impromptu polls?
Uh, let me see. Give me 1 second while what's the question you want to ask?
I'd be curious to know among the audience, and I think the audience would be curious to know, like, maybe you can come up with a range of questions here, which is like, are you looking at Web Vitals? And if so, like to what degree? Right. I'm genuinely curious, as a developer and somebody who works on performance monitoring tools, like obviously there's a lot of attention paid to it. Mike's highlighted that, especially Google pushing it, but I'm curious how that has been received in organizations, right? Smugmug, clearly that's important to them, but we have 100 folks on the call, like, where are people placing that importance in their organizations?
Cool. I just added it, so let me see if I can launch it really quickly.
Yeah, it could pop up at any time, in the next, okay.
It is. Yeah, I think one of the, like for now, our usage has kind of been more of a gathering data and learning, right? So we're tracking this and we're, tracking our performance over time and seeing where we're at on these metrics. And we haven't yet really turned it into actionable steps that we're going to take. I would love on some of our modern stuff to start looking at setting performance budgets and, failing builds or alerting Slack in some way when we have certain metrics that we're not meeting.
Cool.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, go ahead, Jeremy.
It's all right. I was just thinking, I was sort of musing as you were talking, Mike, about like the Web Vitals and how, it's interesting the way that there are these sort of successive approximations towards understanding perceived performance as opposed to like, like the page is loaded, absolutely everything is loaded and we're done. Which, it's a lot easier to measure that way in the back end, but the front end introduces new challenges, and it's the user experience ultimately that matters. So like I was also wondering along the similar line to what Ben was talking about, how, to what extent do we feel like the Web Vitals thing is working? I've talked to a bunch of customers and kind of get varying things. Some people say, oh, it's great, works really well for us. Other people, it's a good guidepost or it's helpful, but it's maybe not everything that we need. How do you at Smugmug sort of think about perceived performance versus like hard load times?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting give and take, because we have a very strong, so our CEO, Don, is very technical, and he built Smugmug himself kind of when it first started, and he's very, very in tune with the performance of our backend systems and how fast does it take to serve an image, or whether it's on the CDN edge. All those sorts of things are very important. But I think sounds like we have a fire. One of the things we haven't historically really paid attention to is what does that mean for the end user. I think I actually need to check this. Hold on.
Wow.
That might be like lunch and learn first.
It is. I was actually expecting that when we go back into the office for that to happen. But we have two things. One is, here's the answer currently to like, are folks looking to Web Vitals, which is it's like a half 30, like 30% said yes, and then another 35% said no. And then actually the largest percentage is they're exploring and looking into it. So that's cool. Mike, it looks like you're back. Is the sound okay, or should we?
Yeah, no, it's fine. There was a candle that was set up a smoke alarm.
Oh, I'm glad there is no actual.
No.
That's great.
I'm trying to remember where my what thread I had there. I think that the Web Vitals as Google has defined them, and kind of like looking at the 75th percentile and some of the numbers they've kind of set out, they seem to work pretty well for us, for what we've been looking at so far. I think that it's been pretty interesting for me personally as we've been shifting more to this isomorphic server-side rendered React application for our modern code. The extent to which even a slow first paint, so like if it's maybe in the like 1 to 1.5 second range, from what I see, people are very receptive, or they're not bothered by that when the entire page pops in and it loads and it's ready and it's responsive and it's interactive and you're not fetching data. They seem to be very okay with that. And in that world, the time to first byte doesn't matter a whole lot. We can focus on some of the other performance aspects that are like that around our image serving or other areas of the site.
That pattern makes me think of like the GitHub UI, because I think of the GitHub UI as being kind of chunky, like it just kind of like it takes a moment and then it's there. And I think it's okay, but it isn't as zippy as other experiences that prioritize like a cascade of rendering.
Yeah, I think it's a fine balance, and one of the things that we pay attention to is tuning, at least on our modern stuff, tuning the server-side requests we're making. So if we're seeing that our performance is degrading because we're fetching 100 items on the server, maybe we fetch 25 or 30 items and then page in the rest, and trying to find the balance of perceived performance and also like real performance.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because I wanted to like I wanted to bring this up in the sense that I find the most repeatable pattern of performance issues in our product, by which I mean Century, is, and I'm curious if you find this to be similar, and I think that perhaps you do, which is anywhere in the product where you make assumptions about the number of results that might be returned, like let me just get every user first before, or, you know, as a member of this organization or every project, just anything where there's sort of a naive assumption about what the result set is going to be, I find always 100% is linked to some performance issue, because there's always some case. There's always, maybe it's a huge organization, maybe there's thousands of projects or thousands of users or thousands of widgets. What do you think about that?
Yeah, we run into that all the time with not fetching user data so much, but more around if we're trying to load the first 100 images for a user or something like that, then it also means we're loading a bunch of metadata about those images, and we're loading information about all the image sizes that exist for that image. And so it's like a cascading thing. So you have to be aware that it's not necessarily as simple as just loading 100 objects. It might be 100 objects and, you know, other 10 things associated with each object, and being aware of those relationships.
Yeah, 100% agree.
Yeah.
I don't know how we're doing for time, but I'm like bouncing around, you know. So has Smugmug, I'm gonna pivot here. Has Smugmug looked at GraphQL? Because I think GraphQL sort of promotes that this is the problem that they're solving, right? Instead of you having to kind of like load these big heavy API requests, you can kind of like curate down this smaller payload.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic, and one that's definitely one that we've been thinking about. Our API is a REST API, and one of the things that we are looking at is trying to find a way to move to more of like a backend for front-end API that would be a GraphQL. So you might have any given page could have an API endpoint or a GraphQL query that returns only the data it needs, and none of the other added, you know, bloat that our general API returns. And one of the interesting things we've seen there recently is in our new code, which is using React. We're also using Apollo client as a GraphQL client, and they have a way to talk to a REST API using GraphQL queries. So what we're trying to do is bridge the gap between those talking to a REST API, but using GraphQL queries, and then eventually, when we have the time or we're able to do it, we swap from out underneath the REST API is going to be a GraphQL API, and we have the same queries.
That is a really good anecdote, and I think it illustrates that oftentimes when, you know, big software shops move to a technology, like it's usually not a straight line.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a zigzag to get there. Also, Kathy, another interesting poll could be the exact same answers. Could we do the same for GraphQL? Like, it sounds like you know, I'm also curious, like where is GraphQL in the minds of viewers here?
Yeah, I think that ultimately we might end up at a place where we have a mix, right? We have that sort of experience API I was talking about, this GraphQL, and is very purpose-built for a specific use case. And then maybe we still have a general REST API for other things.
Along a similar vein, I'm actually kind of curious also about the like people moving towards server-side rendering. That's something that I've been hearing a lot about, and I have enough gray in my beard that I've seen a lot of like next new things. And this seems to be for some folks the next new thing. And I'm very interested to know like what pushed you in that direction. What gains or have you seen, or what unexpected challenges have come up?
Yeah, I think I'll start with the unexpected challenge. For me personally, one of the things that was something I hadn't really considered is once you get into the situation that you have JavaScript code that could run on the server or on the client, you have to be aware of, and especially when the server, we're not using like Lambda functions or things like that. If you have a long running server, being very careful about what sort of global state you may be creating or accidentally, either on purpose or accidentally, and making sure that you're not leaking state between requests. So in the past where we might, create some sort of local cache within a module file or something like that, being careful, keeping aware that on the server, that thing's going to grow forever, or, you have things leaking between requests, and paying real close attention to that sort of thing. That's been one of the most interesting considerations that we have to keep in mind for me personally.
Yeah, that is interesting. It sort of challenges a lot of like baked in assumptions that you might have forgotten you made about, how like if JavaScript is running on the client, what access to data it has and so forth. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you end up having, in some cases, you have a React component that might, switch behavior based on whether it's running on the server or not. And it just becomes, I think in some cases, it makes it a little bit harder to understand the code you're looking at. I think it can be challenging at times, but I think especially as you kind of get your mindset into that frame of mind, it gets easier.
Yeah, makes sense. I think one of the big promises of server-side rendering is performance. Have you seen that pay off at all yet, or have you gotten to a point where you're able to get those insights?
I think some of so not so much, I don't think yet. I think some of the stuff that the React team is working on for the next major release, and some of the changes they're going to make to allow some streaming rendering, I think will help, because the server-side render is CPU intensive, and it can, especially depending on how much traffic you have, can lead to a slower response time. Like we talked before, you might have a slow initial page load, and some of the streaming stuff they're working on sounds like it could kind of shift it back into where you have a faster time to first byte, and then maybe you can start having more immediate client page loads and start having some loading states and things like that, without it being a quick first response that's just an app skeleton. It has loading indicators all over the place. Maybe it's a balance of both.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think I'm certainly still waiting to see sort of how it plays out. I think we're a little bit early in the adoption cycle of that technology to see if it's really, how that's going to go. But it's very interesting. So thank you for sharing that.
I think we're in the third or fourth iteration of server-side rendering versus single-page applications. So I don't know. I feel like over my career, I've seen us loop back and forth a few times. I don't know if you feel similarly, Mike.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I've learned, especially over my past 10 years at Smugmug, is what we're trying to do now is we're trying to leverage the community and the tooling that exists that other people have built, and trying to, as much as the front end community changes rapidly and is always changing, it's tough to chase. We're trying to ride the wave of what the community is building and what they're providing for us, and we can focus more on the core aspects of our business and not have to worry about this particular way of server-side rendering is the new hot thing. Like, we'll use it if the framework we're using supports it, and if it doesn't, then we won't, and we'll wait to kind of see where that goes, and try to leverage as much open source that we can. very,
very cool. Just to loop back, I think there was a question about like people considered using GraphQL, and I think 2/3 approximately, well, 60% have considered using GraphQL. So yeah, that's pretty cool.
I think it's interesting to say, you have 40% who are like, nope, I'm good. and that's perfectly fair. I don't, to be clear, I don't actually think that like GraphQL is a panacea to all of our woes, and you're, in some ways you're substituting one class of problems for another.
Yeah, so I will say that in my personal experience with the way that we're using it, which is not really GraphQL, but I find that the the writing of a GraphQL query in code is more ergonomic, and some of the static analysis and things like that you can do with GraphQL queries, or validating the schema and things like that. Some of those built-in functionalities, I think those are pretty cool.
So there was a question earlier about the difference of what Sentry does versus synthetic testing. And I know I'm curious, does Smugmug use both? Just primarily like one to see if the service is up and running, and another to see how actual users are experiencing the product. Kind of curious from your
I mean, we have, so as far as other sorts of monitoring we have, we've got all sorts of CloudWatch monitoring and other things like that. We don't do any sort of like synthetic test monitoring. We're relying mostly on Sentry for real user monitoring, and then other sources in AWS or elsewhere for kind of low-level system performance.
Got it.
Also, I mean, nothing's stopping people from using Sentry with synthetic testing. Like, technically, you could fire up some sort of virtual browser like Puppeteer or something, and then use that as the basis of collecting synthetic results, but using the same product.
Yeah, there was actually a real interesting blog post I saw on Sentry's blog the past few weeks or something, where there was an example of instrumenting jest unit tests with the performance monitoring, and I thought that was pretty cool. If I wasn't paying for Sentry volume, if I had it free, then I would do that.
Yeah, I was drawing on exactly that blog post. In that case, the user is the CI runtime, right? But yeah, it's the same idea.
Excellent. And then as an add-on, I think someone just asked, hey, any plans on adding synthetic? We're currently using another tool, but we would love to have everything in Sentry. So question for Jeremy or Ben.
That's probably a me question. I think honestly, so not yet. It's not something that we've really looked into, kind of like the traffic generation side. But as Ben and Mike were just talking about, if you wanted to kind of hook a synthetic harness and gather the results in Sentry, then you could certainly have one place to analyze the data and see what's going on. You could add tags or things like that if you wanted to be able to differentiate the synthetic from the real user traffic. Something we've looked into like very deeply yet, but certainly something we keep in mind for the future.
Excellent. Let me just go through to make sure all the previous questions have been answered. I think there's one other one about whether or not we dog food our own product to improve Sentry. I think we've actually written a blog on it as well. But maybe Jeremy, if you wanted to add any commentary on that.
I mean, do we? Yeah, we do big time. There's a whole bunch of dog fooding blog posts, actually. I know my team has written a couple of them. We look at our performance SLOs in Sentry every week in our
what's an SLO? Can you?
Oh, sorry, our service level objective. So basically, we set a benchmark of, I think in our case we're focusing on P75 LCP as recommended by Google with the Web Vitals. So that's kind of the benchmark we've chosen as this is going to be our representative measure. And then we have a response time. Adam is in the chat and will correct me if I go wrong on the numbers, but I think we set a response time of like 2 seconds for all of our like top pages. So like basically the performance landing page, any of the transaction summary pages. And so using Sentry and performance monitoring, we'll look at, are we meeting those benchmarks week over week? And if we see worrying trends or we dip below, then we'll try to dig in and figure out how. We've caught a couple of regressions that way. We haven't seen any sort of long-term downward trends yet that I'm aware of, but we certainly caught a couple of regressions where we're like, wait a minute, this thing was like way faster last week, what's going on? And found out that we inadvertently introduced an N+1 query or something along those lines. So it's been very helpful that way.
Nice.
I can expand on that, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mike after this because I'm curious what Smugmug does here. But I know that like a constant topic around performance monitoring is like, how do I make my boss or my manager or anybody that I work with care about this? And I don't have the exact answer for that, but I can say that, from a dog fooding perspective, something that we've done is that for all of our product engineering teams, they just as a team reports on, say, the uptime of the services or the products that they're building, they also report a service level objective around performance. And we've gone back and forth over the past year about how to present that. And we do it for a couple of reasons. One is to actually force our development team to use our own product with like measurable results that they can share with the rest of the organization. The second one is, well, we want to actually have a positive experience for customers and something that we can actually point to say that we're doing poorly or we're doing better over time, et cetera. And actually the way that we calculate that, what we have right now, is like for a given team, we know what sort of product area that they're responsible for, and we actually like weight the page load, or sorry, like individual page loads are weighted by the we weight by the traffic to pages. And at the time, I want to sort of make a story here about how this turned into a product improvement. At the time, we thought that was sort of like the best way to capture a team's sort of like, their impact on performance for the scope of pages that they deal with. You don't want average because teams are responsible for like some settings pages that maybe a user touches 1 out of 100 times, right? So we kind of weighted it to what pages are the most highly trafficked. So in Century, for example, that's like the issues page, looking at issue details, or the performance landing page. Like those are high traffic pages, right? And so for a time, the way that we calculated that was to actually dump to CSV some data to a spreadsheet, and then we did some math, and then we output that. And we didn't like that. So that's why actually in the past month or two, we introduced equations into the Discover tool set so that you can actually do some light math and sort of do your own kind of light spreadsheet math in Discover so you can pop those results out. So, that's an example of how, sometimes like features that appear in Century are inspired by solving our own problems. So I'm curious to communicate your sort of, you mentioned you're like budgets for like an in progress thing, but I'm curious if there's anything around this you can speak to.
Yeah, I think the way that I was finally able to get traction with my manager and up the chain was as Google really started pushing these things and saying that by this date, these specific metrics, you need to be hitting these values, or otherwise it's going to hurt your page rank. So being able to point to that was pretty helpful. And as I mentioned earlier, and you just touched on, we're not setting objectives right now, but we are tracking them and sharing them with leadership across the organization, on a regular cadence. And then actually similar to what you're saying, trying to do some sort of spreadsheet math and track things. And so it sounds like there's some features there in Discover that I could probably leverage to make some of that reporting easier.
Yeah, I mean, probably the takeaway is that anybody who's doing this kind of work, like there has to be some kind of distillation of what you're doing into something that, other members of the company can understand. Because you can't just show them like a flame chart and go, look, it's fast. And no one's going to really understand that.
Nice. Mike, I was also curious about what your typical like release or triage process is like, because as you're shipping new features, is there, I know that a lot of times when we get questions, it's more about best practices. So I'm curious, like in the 10 years, what kind of best practices have developed at Smugmug?
Yeah, I'll talk about what we implemented recently, leveraging Century, and I'm pretty proud of this. So we came up with a thing on the front end team here at Smugmug that we're calling the Century Sentry. So instead of being on call, you are the Sentry that is paying attention to the Century alerts that we have going to a Slack channel, right? So you're responsible for accepting that for a week you're going to get interrupted when that Slack channel pings if there's an exception, or an unhandled error or something like that. And related to that, we have certain thresholds that we have set. They're very loose and not really objectives that we'd want to go to, but for some of our pages, we do have some alerting set up around performance. So keeping an eye on that as well as the job, and then triaging it to the right team and making sure that the tickets get written that is prioritized. So that's what we're doing now. Prior to that, I wouldn't say that we had much of a process really.
That's cool. I think it develops. I love that term. I may steal it. Century Sentry. I've heard of this also being done, I believe at Atlassian, where they have one person manage their list of issues every week, and then they're the ones that go in and look at, oh, is this something we want to deal with, or is this something that we can wait till later? So good to know.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, in a lot of cases, it might end up being just noise, right? Like there's an old browser that doesn't support some API we're using, or it's a browser extension. I mean, you know, Century does a good job of filtering some of that stuff out, but it helps to have an assigned person that's just kind of accepting that they'll get interrupted from time to time, and not having to have, you know, one person always pay attention to it.
Very cool. I wanted to pause and just ask the folks who are still with us if you have any questions. We wanted to kind of, if anyone does, feel free to raise your hand and I can even promote you so that you can ask questions live.
I do have one other little anecdote I could share with the performance monitoring. So when we first adopted the performance monitoring tools from Century, it was at the same time as some work we were doing to switch to some new Elasticsearch infrastructure. And we didn't yet have monitoring set up in CloudWatch or elsewhere to monitor the health of the Elasticsearch cluster, basically. And so we set up some alerting in Century around the, I think, largest contentful paint metric. And that specific alert was able to catch like if an Elasticsearch node went down and our performance started degrading because the rest of the nodes got overloaded before we had the actual real monitoring in place that we needed.
That's awesome to hear. Yeah, we weren't expecting that, but that's really, yeah.
Well, it's not great. I mean, like it was bad because, you know, you have to, in order to make it so the alerts aren't flapping a lot, we had to set up, you know, like a 30-minute window or something. So it's like we're hearing it after 30 minutes of this being a problem for our users. So obviously, like building the real monitoring, that was the solution there. But it was interesting. It did, you know, it did help us. We didn't have, you know, customers having to deal with that for hours on end. It was at least caught somewhat early.
Yeah, before the other tools. Great. So I'm gonna see if like has anyone has any questions? Let me just go through all the questions that have been answered and make sure we've covered everything. I think one question that was asked about whether or not we would have a demo today. And so we'll actually, if anyone is interested, shoot us a note and we'll make sure that we follow up and do a demo, especially on distributed tracing. It's a very cool demo.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm excited to try. So right now we have, as far as our performance tracing goes, we're doing tracing from our server-side render in Node.js. So we're tracing various parts of that render and the API calls it makes to our REST API. And then we get that associated with the client-side page load and the web vitals that get tracked there. The other aspect I would love to do, and I did prototype it earlier this month, our backend is mostly PHP. So instrumenting the PHP REST API that we're relying on for the front end would be the next obvious step. And I'm hoping that I can get some buy-in to kind of put some resources on doing that, because then we'll get, at least for our modern front end code, we'll have an entire view of the whole system as far as the performance goes.
Got it. Great. I think one question that's come in is around how our team uses Century to uncover like what issue occurred. Let me see. I think if, unfortunately, the question was written anonymously. If you actually add your email address, we will definitely follow up with you and basically show the demo. But we also have a bunch of videos that we can refer you to as well. Jeremy or Ben or Rahul, would anyone like to just talk about generally how we do things?
Sorry, Kathy, I'm not sure I fully understand what the question is asking. I don't know if you can repeat or if I'm just not getting it right now.
Sure. Let me go back to the question. I think it was around basically how our team uses Sentry to either look at a event or identify issues that cause bottlenecks. Yeah, I think this is where having that demo.
Yeah, we need the demo. I agree. Yeah.
So folks, we will follow up. Just shoot us a quick email and we can definitely do that. And we'll plan to actually have that demo at our next Lunch and Learn, definitely. Great. Any other questions? One of the questions I'm seeing is alerts based on percentage. I think it's in the early adopter program. Any plans on when that will go GA, I guess?
I don't have a specific date for that. The workflow team is working on that initiative. I think it, generally speaking, it's in beta, so it'll be somewhat soonish, but I don't think we have an exact target date, and I don't unfortunately know of like kind of the internal objectives that we're trying to hit before we go live. Generally, when we do these things, like we're looking, to validate certain performance characteristics, we're looking to make sure that it's valuable, and so it's less a question of time and more a question of making sure that we've kind of checked the objectives that we want with the feature before we go live. So it's also, not an exact time frame that I can give you.
Excellent. Okay, great. And then, let's see. I guess this is a good question. Originally, I thought it was around monetary costs, but one of the anonymous questions is like, are there any performance hits for enabling Sentry in a PHP application?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Century, some of our Century can answer more than I can, but I would say that one of the concerns we had on our end as far as kind of prototyping that was around concerns about performance, since we do have a large monolithic PHP application, which is part of why I think that targeting just like the API piece of that would be probably what we would do.
Yeah, my understanding is PHP is tricky because it's synchronous, right? We're actually engaged on a pretty big project right now to sort of like completely measure this impact for every SDK. So we're going to have more concrete answers that like where I can give you percentages and things. So stay tuned. I think that, but our advice will always be like experiment. Even if we tell you numbers, I would never, even if we come up with numbers, they're going to be in a synthetic environment where we try to recreate the circumstances of other applications, and that will only get you so far, right? So we're going to recommend that people, put it up in an isolated environment, maybe a staging environment, and observe and take a look.
I love it. Trust but verify. Let's see. So any remaining last thoughts or like advice that folks will want to give about this topic or about any topic? Mike, any suggestions on folks delving into this world or what to look for?
I just highly recommend starting to, whether it's with Century or another service, just starting to at least track this data. And so you have it, and it gives you all sorts of insights into the real world experience that you're delivering to your customers, because it is easy to forget that like we're very privileged to have a modern MacBook Pro with a very fast internet connection. And that's not what everyone has, and it is interesting to see across your entire user base what sort of experience they're having.
Jeremy or Ben?
Yeah, I would just second that. I'm glad Mike said it though, because it sounds really self-serving if I say it. But there are always surprises. We built the tool and we still found out things that we didn't know that were very surprising. I also like to take a minute to thank. I know Kathy, you will do this, but I wanted to say thanks, Mike, for joining us. This has been really great, and I've appreciated the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Bennett,
no, I think let's take that. That was a good closing. So I'm gonna roll with that. Yeah. Thanks, Mike, for joining us. Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks, Mike. You've been terrific guests, and then Jeremy and Ben, and also Rahul for being great panelists, and then all the folks who are attending for asking the great questions. This like I really enjoyed the session, learned a ton, especially about server-side apps. So great. Well, thank you, everyone. And then again, if you're interested in speaking at one of these feature events, ping us and we'll be glad to have you join. So with that, thanks, everyone. Take care.
Right.